In today's strategy segment, we are going to be discussing how you should make a point to check raise with your best made hands and your draws. Because you want to make a point to play big pots with your best hands. And if you only check raise with your absolute best hands, well, you're going to be very easy to play against. So you have to check raise with a polarized range, meaning your best hands that are happy to get money in, and then some draws that have decent equity even when you do get called. Now, when you are looking at the draws to check raise, depending on your stack depth, you may be check raising with your absolute best draws, like straight draws and flush draws that have both straight and flush draws. Sometimes your medium strength draws, like open-ended straight draws, and sometimes low equity draws, like gut shot straight draws, or an overcard with a backdoor flush draw. And we're going to be going through a lot of examples to show you exactly this. When you are check raising the flop, you're going to want to make a point to check raise far more often in two specific scenarios. That is when the flop is excellent for your range, such as when, let's say, the early position player raises, you call from the big blind, and the flop comes 7-6-4. In that scenario, the early position raiser will have almost no overly premium hands like straights, two pairs, and sets, right? Whereas you, in the big blind, will have lots of straights, two pairs, and sets. So in that spot, you're going to be check raising very frequently. If the flop is not excellent for your range, such as, say, king, queen, jack, whenever under the gun raises and you call in the big blind, you're not going to do much check raising at all because they have all the straights, sets, and two pairs, and you don't, because you would have re-raised with aces, kings, queens, jacks, king, queen suited, stuff like that, right? Another time you're going to want to check raise the flop very frequently is when you are facing a tiny bet. Tiny bets have become all the rage over the last few years, where the initial raiser will raise pre-flop to, let's say, two big blinds. You call the big blind, the flop comes, you check, and then they bet one or two big blinds. Against tiny bets, you want to check raise very frequently. Against big bets, though, you usually do not. And that's because, assuming your opponent is playing good, strong, game theory optimal poker, their big bet size will often be very polarized. It turns out you want to play big pots with big hands, like we were just saying, in game theory optimal world and in practical real world poker. And that results in the bigger bet sizes mostly being used with good made hands and draws. And against a range that contains a lot of really good made hands, you don't want to check raise very often. When people bet smaller, though, that's usually when they're betting with their entire range or with more medium strength hands. And against a medium strength range, your best hands that want to play big pots do quite well. So when you're facing a small bet size, usually you're going to be check raising very frequently. Let's take a look at some examples where you're going to be check raising somewhat often. Let's say 40 big blinds deep, the button raises and the big blind calls. It's worth noting the button's range is going to be pretty wide. So it's actually going to line up kind of on top of the big blind's range to some extent. This is very different compared to when the under the gun player raises because they don't have all the low middle connected cards. So in this example, by the way, we're going to be going through all examples, 40 big blinds deep, where the button raises and the big blind calls in this video because I want to show you a very common scenario you're going to encounter on a regular basis, especially if you're playing poker tournaments. But this concept applies to some extent when you're playing deeper stack too. In this scenario, button raises, big blind calls. Flop comes 6-3-2, two spades. Big blind checks, and the button bets 3.5 big blinds. Now, this is not a small bet, and it turns out this is not a spot where the button should be betting small all that often. In game theory optimal world, they should be using a bigger bet size on this board because this board favors the initial raiser so much to the point that when the button does bet, they usually want to have a pretty good made hand or a draw. So we're not going to be check raising this one all that often, even though the flop is good for us because the opponent used a decently big bet size. That said, we are still check raising a decent amount. When they bet 3.5, we're going to be check raising small to something like 8.7 big blinds. Typically, when your opponent bets tiny, like say they bet 1.5 big blinds, we'll be check raising to something like 7. But when they bet kind of big, like 3.5, you're check raising a smaller multiple to something like 8 or 9 big blinds. Anyway, what is our check raising range? It's the hands in red. We have ace 6, king 6, queen 6. Oh, alarm's going off. Something important I need to do right now. I have no clue what it is. Making this video is the most important thing. If you're glad that I'm here today with you right now, click the like and subscribe button down below. Click the notification bell. Notice a6, king 6, queen 6, 6-5, and 6-4 are check raising a lot. Why? Well, if you think about it, these are some of the best hands in our range. Notice we would have re-raised all of the overpairs pre-flop. right? This is a spot where when the button raises 40 big blinds deep, we're either going to be raising or going all in from out of position with all of these pairs. If you do not know to do that, make sure you check out pokercoaching.com. We have game theory optimal pre-flop charts for all sorts of scenarios, such as this common one where the button raises and the big blind has to figure out what to do. All the best hands get re-raised or shoved all in. So anyway, ace-6, king-6, queen-6 are pretty much the best hands we can have. Notice also we do have 5-4, which is raising sometimes. It's mixing between calling and raising. You may say, why would 5-4 call? It's calling because it's the super duper nuts and it doesn't really care if your opponent stays in the pot. You may say, what about the flush draw? Aren't we worried about that? And no, not really. Sometimes they're going to have a flush draw and they're going to get there. So we also have 6-3 suited in our range. Kind of feels the same as 5-4. It's just a really, really, really good hand, so it doesn't raise so often. 3-2 is raising every time when we have it. And then we are raising with some draws. What are draws on 6-3-2? Well, the most logical draws are going to be flush draws and straight draws. So notice, these suited hands in this region, all these that are raising a tiny frequency of the time, these are all going to be straight draws with flush draws. These hands like to raise very, very often. Like notice 7-4 is about 25% filled in with raises. That's because 7-4 is raising with 7-4 spades is raising every time. Notice over here though, we have king 5, queen 5, jack 5, ace 4, king 4, queen 4, jack 4. These hands are also putting in the raise a large chunk of the time because they have a gut shot. So in this spot, we are check raising to 8.7 big blinds out of our 40 big blind stack with our best made hands, and you are willing to get it in with the queen 6 and better, or 6-5 and 6-4 and better. And we're also check raising with some junky draws like jack 4, queen 4, king 4, and some high equity draws like straight flush draws that are also not going to fold if the opponent goes all in. Let's take a look at a few other hands that are perhaps uncommon for you to consider raising. 5-2 and 4-2. These are bottom pairs with a gut shot. Not a great hand, but okay. These are going to be spades a large chunk of the time, so if it's a pair and a flush draw, it's obviously pretty good. Notice 6-4 and 6-5 are check raising for value, and they're not going to fold to a shove. You may say, is 6-5 and 6-4 good enough to check raise? And it turns out, yes, when you're about 40 big blinds deep, any pair plus gut shot straight draw, especially top pair plus gut shot straight draw, is a pretty good hand that you're willing to check raise and get it in. What a lot of people do wrong in this exact spot is they do not check raise a6, king 6, or queen 6 because they don't realize those are actually the best hands that you can possibly have in this spot, or at least some of the best hands you can have. And if you don't check raise ace, king 6, king 6, and queen 6, you in turn don't get to bluff nearly as often with some of these rather junky hands that you would like to bluff. By the way, also note that queen 5, queen 4, jack 5, jack 4, king 5, king 4, they're about halfway filled in, meaning half are folds, half are calls or raises. The ones with spades are continuing. So king of spades, 4, or king with a 4 spades. Not the ones without a spade. Having that spade does give you additional equity that will allow you to check raise more often. Okay, let's now take a look at paired boards. Let's take a look at queen, queen, 2. Same scenario, except for now, the button's going to bet 1.5 big blinds. A very common thing you'll see on paired boards in Game Theory Optimal World is the initial pre-flop raiser will continuation bet small, like 1 or 1.5 big blinds. Facing that tiny bet, assuming you have a decent amount of trips in your range, you want to raise very frequently. And in this scenario, actually quite a lot. Notice we have all these queens in our range that want to check raise. The opponent bets 1.5. In this spot, because we're check raising with so many super nut hands, a queen, we can check raise tiny to 5.1 big blinds because we don't really care on average if the opponent sticks around, which is pretty cool. Notice also what's check raising. We have a lot of 2s check raising, right? Turns out that's good enough to put in the check raise in the spot because this is a hand that's almost always good, but very vulnerable to being outdrawn. Yeah, you're going to run into the better hands sometimes, but that's okay. So that makes a lot of sense, right? Pairs and trips, check raise. Notice a lot of people, by the way, do not check raise the 2s, and that is a mistake. They don't check raise often enough. What else is check raising, though? Well, you want to check raise with some draws. What are draws on queen, queen, 2? Turns out it's kind of hard to find them. Most of the draws you're going to check raise are going to be hands that have a backdoor flush draw and or backdoor straight draw. So like jack 10 is check raising almost every time. Same thing with jack 9, 10, 9, jack 8, 10, 8, 9, 8. These are, notice how a quarter of these are folding. The ones without the backdoor flush draw, so the clubs are folding. So jack 8 of clubs folds, but the other ones check raise small. Notice all down here as well. Cards that wrap around the 2 or are around the 2 such that they have backdoor straight draws. 6-5, 6-4, 6-3, 5-4, 5-3, and 4-3 all do a ton of check raising too. I think a lot of players who have studied game theory optimal poker find these raises with the Jack 9, 10, 9, Jack 8, 10, 9, 10, 8, 9, 8, and these down here. But I don't think they find these in the middle. This is a spot where, because we have so many queens in our range that want to raise and put money in the pot, we also get to check raise with some pretty junky hands, like Jack 4, backdoor flush draw, Queen 4, backdoor flush draw, King 3, King 4, etc., etc., etc. Notice we also have some Ace X check raising, Ace 4, Ace 3 offsuit check raising, which feels a little frisky to me. I probably would have missed those. I would have just called those. And look, by studying these GTO spots, you learn how to play better, and that's exactly what we're going for. Notice against a small bet, we also call with a lot of ace high and king high. You can't go around folding any ace high or good king high on the paired boards to a tiny bet. Notice what is folding, really just all the offsuit stuff that has nothing. And this is a large chunk of your range that is folding. So whenever you're folding, whenever you just have nothing, you just end up check folding. What I want to show, though, is that we are check raising this spot a ton, and that's something a lot of people do not do. Notice also, one more thing, Queen 2 does not raise. Whenever you have a full house or just some super, super, super duper nut hand, you usually do not raise it when you're playing 40 big blinds deep, or for the most part, because you really want to keep your opponent in when they have 0% equity. Let's take a look at 6-3-3. Now, this is a board where the button should not bet every single time because they don't have a whole lot of threes in their range, whereas you in the big blind do. So assuming your opponent's playing well, this is how you should check raise. Notice now we're going to check raise lots of trips. Notice we have lots of threes in our range and lots of sixes. So again, a very similar pattern where a lot of our sixes are raising, especially the best ones, and the ones with backdoor equity like 6-5, 6-4, right? And then a lot of threes. Then we also get to check raise with a lot of draws. What are our draws on 6-3-3? Well, 5-4 raises a lot. What else? 7-5 and 7-4 do a decent amount of raising. But then we also have to find additional bluffs. Turns out hands with a 5 or a 4 are going to have a lot of backdoor equity. So we see like 9-5, 9-4, 8-5, 8-4 check raising very frequently. These are all check raising with a backdoor flush draw. And then we have overcards to the 6. Notice 9-8, 9-7, 8-7, 10-7, 10-8. All these hands are check raising a large chunk of the time too. And you're going to find that in GTO world, overcards to top pair that don't have a whole lot of showdown value usually do a pretty good amount of raising. It's a little bit different if the board was 6-6-3, because then if you make a pair with like 9-7, it's not all that great because you still could just be crushed by the trips. In this spot, though, if your opponent does have a 6 and you pair your 9 or 7, you have the best hand, right? So these are the hands that can be check raising in this spot very often. Notice what is not raising. Again, ace high, king high, queen high. These hands are often just good enough to check and call against a small bet on this paired board. Your total trash, again, just folds. But again, I want to show you, a lot of people do not check raise their 6s in this spot nearly often enough. And that's a mistake. Let's look at a 3 flush board first before we move forward to some more, call them normal boards. Let's say 40 big blinds deep, button raises, big blind calls. King, 9, 3, all spades, big blind checks, button bets tiny. This is a spot where they're going to be betting roughly 75-ish% of the time. What should we do? Well, this is a spot where we have to be very concerned that the opponent has flushes in their range already. So we don't get a check raise quite so often. So this is a board that is not quite as good for our range because even though we do have a lot of flushes in our range, so does the button. So in this spot, we are check raising. All of these hands that are in red that are suited are flushes. So all these hands are flushes that are raising. Notice, very notably, we do not check raise the nut flush if we have it. We just check and call because the opponent has 0% equity or close enough to 0% equity. So we do not raise that too often. Notice also stuff like, well, all the various flushes that we have are mixing between raising and calling. So you're not raising every single time you have a flush. Notice that King 9 is raising. King 9 is just good enough to check raise and get in. King 3 is check raising a decent chunk of the time as well. We have this random bottom pairs going for the check raise. I would have missed those in this spot, but again, this is why you study poker. Notice 6-3, 5-3, 4-3, and 3-2 are going for the check raise some portion of the time, essentially using those as a junky draw. That's neat to see. And then we have various offsuit hands check raising. These are our primary bluffs. These are hands with the spade. So Queen of Spades, 8. Jack of Spades, 8. 10 of Spades, 8. Same thing, Queen 7, Queen 6, Queen 5, Queen 4. A small portion of the time are all putting in the check raise because those are essentially draws, right? You have the Queen High flush draw. It's not a great hand, don't get me wrong, But it is a spot where you can check raise in this scenario to a small amount, because when we are check raising, we have a super duper nut hand, right? So when the opponent bets 1.5, we're going to 5. We can check raise queen of spades 7 or 8 of spades 6 even, and then fold if the opponent re-raises because we have almost no equity. Notice that a lot of our ace X is not check raising again. We do have a little bit with the ace 4 and the ace 2, but ace X offsuit with the ace of spades just checks and calls, because you don't want to check raise that and then face an all-in or re-raise, because then you'd have to fold out a hand that actually has pretty good equity. Essentially, in spots like this, you want to be check raising really good nut hands that are never folding, mainly like king, queen, and better. And then you want to be check raising with high equity. Well, not even high equity. You want to be check raising your flushes because those are super nuts. And then you want to check raise some low equity draws, because you can check raise those, and then if you get shoved on, you can easily fold. All right, let's take a look at a few more spots. Queen 6-4 with a flush draw. Big blind checks, button bets small. This is a spot where the button, again, is not going to bet very often, only about half of the time. By the way, if your opponent continuation bets too often, a lot of people do not make the right adjustment. We actually have a large section on pokercoaching.com in the advanced tournament and cash game course discussing how to exploit players who continuation bet too often. And what you should do, long story short, very simply put, is that if you have the range and nut advantage, meaning you have way more nut hands and just strong hands than your opponent, you should check raise way more often. So like in this spot, we should probably be check raising way more often if the opponent does bet too frequently. Or especially on the low card boards, like the 6-3-2 board. If the opponent bets every time there, you're going to check raise way more often. On boards that do not favor you, though, you want to be calling more often, because you're still going to have a lot of nut hands. Well, your opponent's range still has a whole lot of nut hands in it that you don't want to be check raising into, even if they are betting too frequently. So if you have a flop that's good for you and your opponent continuation bets too frequently, you check raise way more frequently. If the flop is good for their range, though, you should be check calling more frequently. Okay, anyway, here we are, queen 6-4. What are we check raising? Well, it's going to be our best made hands. What are our best made hands on queen 6-4? Turns out your best top pairs pretty much always check raise on normal boards, just like three random cards. Turns out king, queen, queen, jack, queen 10 check raise very, very often. Notice queen 6 and queen 4 check raise a ton as well. Same thing with 6-4. Fine. Makes a whole lot of sense. Now we have to find some draws. Well, all of these little slivers of suited hands are flush draws that are raising. So that makes a whole lot of sense. We're check raising about half our flush draws, check calling the other half. Notice again, ace high flush draws do not raise. The best king high flush draws often do not raise. They just check call instead. Then we have 7-5, check raising a decent amount, 5-3, a decent amount, which makes some sense. We have some gut shots like 7-3, 5-3 getting in there when you have them some small portion of the time. And then we just have some total airball bluffs that almost no one finds. This is a spot where when you have a hand like king 5 or king 7 or king 3 or king 2 offsuit, well, with a spade. So king of spades 7, king of spades 7, king of spades 5. These hands get in there and check raise a decent chunk of the time. That's something a lot of people do not do. But notice here, like king 5 with a spade, check raises almost every single time. Why? Because it's essentially a junky draw, right? You're check raising this draw that has an overcard to the top pair, which is nice to have because if you pair the king, it's probably good. And then also with the backdoor straight draw and backdoor flush draw. It's a pretty good hand to raise. What if the opponent bets bigger, though? Notice here the opponent bet 1.5 big blinds. What if they use a bigger size and they pot it? Well, now you fold way more often, and also you raise way less often. Remember, we talked about that way back at this first point. When the bet size you're facing is small, you check raise more often, right? Here, we're facing a bigger bet size, so we check raise almost never. King, queen, queen, jack, a few flushes, a few junky draws, few bottom pairs. Not a whole lot, right? So when you're facing a bigger bet, you check raise way less often. What about king, queen, 6? Now, notice that on king, queen, 6, all of our hands that we want to check raise are almost always good, but very vulnerable to being outdrawn by the opponent's range. So this is a spot where now we're going to start check raising much bigger over the 1.5 big blind bet on king, queen, 6, 2 hearts. Notice we're check raising our best made hands. Again, good kings and better. Check raising to 7.7 big blinds in this spot over the 1.5 big blind bet. And then flush draws. Lots of flush draws. We also have some bottom pairs getting in there. Turns out bottom pair is an okay hand to check raise bluff, which is kind of neat to see. But again, a lot of people don't take the king 9, king 10, king jack, and check raise it with the idea they're just going to get all their money in on this flop. They think, all right, I'm going to call and I'm going to see what develops. But it turns out that is a big mistake. What if the opponent bets bigger? How often are we going to check raise then? Well, I can tell you it's going to be way less often. Question is how much way less often? Turns out, almost never. Now, in GTO world, the opponent should actually bet using a 7.7 big blind bet into the 5.9 big blind pot. So they're over-potting it about 8% of the time with their range. They're betting 74% of the time with their range, but the big bet size is used about 8%, so not very often. When we are check raising in this spot, though, we are check raising with exactly king jack and ace high flush draws all in because the opponent bets so big. Remember, we only have 40 big blinds. Notice, though, we're not raising very often at all. So 2 instances so far. Queen 6-4 against a big bet, we almost never raise. King queen 6 against a big bet, we almost never raise. Keep that in mind. Super duper important. Let's take a look at another spot against a big bet. Say the flop comes ace jack 9. Big blind checks, button bets, pot. Again, we're just not going to raise all that often. Now, if they had bet even bigger, we would check raise less often and probably start to have an all-in range again. But here, we're going to be check raising our best hands, which is mainly jack 9, and our best aces, mainly ace 10, ace 9, ace 8, ace 7. Some draws. What are draws on ace jack 9? Well, it turns out we want to check raise only our junky draws here, like 10-7. We do not want to check raise queen 10 or 10-8 so often, because if we check raise queen 10 or 10-8 and the opponent goes all in, we would be in a roughly break-even spot. So you're going to find 40 big blinds deep against big bets. The decent but non-premium draws, like open-ended straight draws, really, really, really do not want to raise, because if you raise and get shoved on, you have to fold or call in a roughly break-even spot, and that's not what you want for all of your chips. All right? What if the opponent bets small, though? By the way, the button's going to bet 100% of the time on this flop, mixing big sizes and small sizes. Against the smaller size, we're now going to check raise way more ace-x. Notice ace 6 and better is getting in there with a raise a large chunk of the time. And now we can check raise some of our other weaker draws, like 10-8, 8-7. Well, 10-8 and 8-7 primarily. These are hands that don't mind check raising and then folding to a shove. So when the opponent bets 1.5, you can make it something like 7. And if they shove you, you can fold the 10-8. Notice again, though, we're not really doing it with queen 10 all that often. Although we are doing it sometimes. More often now, because essentially if the opponent now makes a bigger all-in relation to the pot, we can then fold because we're not getting nearly the right pot odds. By the way, if you do check raise any ace here and your opponent goes all in, you call. You're not folding. A lot of people think, oh, 40 big blinds deep, I don't want to get stacked. But look, by playing overly cautious in these spots, you're just not going to accumulate chips, and you're not going to be able to bluff nearly as often as you should be. Notice some other bluffs that are getting in here that almost no one finds. We have the 10-4, 10-3, 10-2, king 2, queen 2 suited. So these are backdoor flush draws with a random backdoor straight draw. Whew, that's a tough one to find. I'm trying to think. Have I check raised a 10-2 suited in this spot ever? I don't know if I have. Honestly, I don't think Jonathan Little has ever check raised a 10-2 suited in this spot. And you know what? That is a leak I'm going to plug. And I hope you do too. So that's it for today. Remember, you want to play big pots with your best hands. And if you only check raise your best hands, you're going to be easy to play against because your opponents can just fold. So you must check raise polarized with a range of your best made hands and some draws. And very importantly, check raise way more often when the flop is excellent for your range and you just have a lot of nut hands. This is going to be low card flops and flops where the board is paired. And you're going to want to check raise way more often when the bet size you're facing is small. That's it for today. If you enjoyed the video, click the like and subscribe button down below. Click the notification bell. We make a lot of strategy segments here, and I want to make sure you fully enjoy them and fully learn from them. Good luck in your games. Have fun, and I'll talk to you next time.